Peace, family. Welcome to We Start Colonialism and African Esquire TV. I'm doing a special edition today. It's going to send some messages, let people know I'm getting started. But just to let you all know, so today's going to be a special edition of African Esquire TV. Some of you, I'm sure by now, most of you who know this channel knows that I wrote a book which I have right here called Fostering False Identity. I wrote it in the beginning of this year, and I had intended to basically continually have conversations about the subject matters in the book, particularly going chapter by chapter. And I started off in the beginning of the year with chapter 1. And you know, it's funny, I was pushing it back, and I realized, oh my gosh, this year is almost up, and we basically didn't even go through the rest of the book. Although I've done a lot of interviews about the book, and I've talked about it, you know, on this channel. I've talked about it on other platforms, but I do want to go through some more information, particularly to really share, because there's a lot of information inside of this that I think is very vital to Africans in America, African parents and African families. The other thing, though, is that I feel like it's a good way to end off the year and particularly switch gears next year. You know, I've been playing the ad to my book and talking about it continually, but hopefully, you know, after this, I feel like people will be more armed with knowledge about the book. So I do think I should probably post hey Shakara, what's up? Post a link to the book, but we're going to just get started with going through a number of the concepts that had gone into this book. And just to give everyone a prequel, again, I wrote this book. I used to be a public defender representing children in abuse and neglect cases. And whenever I was a public defender, one of the things that I started recognizing is that this system that is supposed to be a charitable system, this system is supposed to be one that's protecting children, is really a setup. As we know, white supremacy, how it operates, it always operates as a setup. They give you their reason for wanting to create this system, and it's always good reasons. It's always because they want to help Africans, also always because they want to help poor people. But really, they have a real agenda that's always present. And so it's on us to recognize those agendas and to organize around them so that we ensure that we are not being caught inside of the web of lies that white supremacy consistently has us in. So I'm going to post just the link to the book in case anyone would like to purchase. And I'm just going to get started. Hopefully more people join in as we go or watch the playback. And I'm going to get started on just talking about the history that they do not want you to know about the foster care system. So I think, number one, a lot of people think that the foster care system in the United States began as something that was there to protect children. We're always given the worst scenarios of what abuse is, and that's kind of how they sell themselves. So you'll hear about a horrible story of a mother burning her children, or a father or mother molesting. Like, you'll hear like these horrible stories, and that gets to be like the facade that the system uses. So therefore, whenever the system is operating negatively and targeting Africans and doing things that go contrary to our interests, there's really no one there to say, hey, this system should be done away with, because at the end of the day, you have present in your mind a reminder of the worst scenarios that exist. You know, so if you've heard horrible abuse stories, a parent leaving their child in the car and a child dying, if you heard of parents cutting your children, you're going to feel like this system is addressing a real problem. This system is actively going after parents who shouldn't have children, and that's where you stop. But if you don't know that the system, overwhelmingly, that's not what the system's dealing with. Overwhelmingly, what the system is dealing with are parents who are just poor, parents who don't have the same means as the white people down the street, the parents who don't have the same economic benefits. And so it's important for us to really, you know, take the veil off of this system and say, okay, we see what you are, we see what you're doing, and we're going to organize as Africans to have institutions that are representative of our people. So with that, let's just go into chapter 2. So chapter 2 goes into child welfare for whites. And reason why I called it that is because we should understand that the child welfare system, which eventually formed the foster care system, but it was more so the child welfare system, it really was not created for everyone. Originally, it was created for white people, but more specifically, it was created for immigrants, European immigrants that came to America if you do not know, the people who we call white today, so for example, if you see someone white skin, you just call them white. At one point, they were not considered white in America. That is because Anglo-Saxon was what they considered white. So they would have basically kind of like how you hear in South Africa, there are like tiers of races. So you have, the pures and, the half-breeds and all that stuff. That's kind of like similar to how America was set up. They said Anglo-Saxons, these are the real whites. And then you had people like the Irish, the Jews, the Germans who came over from Europe, and they were kind of, they would literally call some of them like white niggers. That's a phrase that they would use. So understanding that white is a concept that we understand it as, whenever we see someone as white and we automatically associate that person with power, there was a real systematic effort to create that. It didn't exist in the beginning. And so what the American system had to do was figure out, what are we going to do with all these white immigrants that don't fit into our society? How do we make them of us? How do we purify them? Kind of like how, Hitler, we got to make them as pure as possible so that they can be a part of our grand scheme. And the way that they did that was actually through the child welfare system. So we're going to go through some things really quickly. So just for more of a backstory, some people think, again, that the child welfare system was about helping children. We should understand that historically, child welfare, that was not the function. Historically, in fact, whenever you look at families and you look at, like, let's say a parent beats their child or something like that, the position of America was that that's your private business. That's not our business. You want to do that to your kids, unless you go extreme and really extreme with hurting your children, we're not going to step in. What gave them the reason to step in was because, as I said, you had an influx of immigrants into these northeastern cities. So I'm going to just say a few of them. So this was from 1850 to 1865. From the first wave of immigration into these cities, and we know New York City is a big one, but it's important to emphasize, really northeastern cities in the U.S. that were more populous at the time, was from 1820 to 1830. That was 4.5 million Irish immigrants that came to the United States, and 5 million immigrants that came from Germany during the 19th century. Now, then you had a second wave of immigration that was from 1880 to 1820. 20 million immigrants came to America from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. And I'm so used to saying Africa, Southern Europe. And more than 4 million of those immigrants were Italian and 2 million were Jews. So to give you a picture of what this looks like, you have a people who basically they have their setup. The Anglo-Saxon Europeans are like, this is what we have going on. And then all of a suddenly, all of these immigrants who were not basically planned for are flooding the cities. Now, originally, when they came to America, they while they were never treated like Africans and they were never treated like Native Americans, because again, we have a racial hierarchy inside of this system. They're not going to do you as bad as they do to Africans. But what they did do is find ways to discriminate against these new immigrants. So basically, they barred them from jobs. A lot of them were living in slums. If you watch the older movies, you'll see that like these Irish slums inside of New York City. And this created a problem for the ruling class, because if anyone knows, poverty, whenever you're consistently, when it's systemic and institutionalized, it creates a situation where conditions are brewing. And this becomes a threat to the ruling class, because they understand that they're in a very delicate position. They have all of these people who are poor and they want to keep their money. They want to be safe while they're keeping their money. They don't want to have to suffer any consequences for their wealth. So if you're of the ruling class and you're realizing this, you're really getting nervous. And in fact, there was actually a riot that occurred in 1863 that really heightened the tension. It was called the draft riot. It was these immigrants, European immigrants, who were rioting because, one, draft policies of the United States, but also rioting because they realized, these conditions, you have these whites who are being treated better. We want something more. And so this became really concerning to the ruling class in America. So enters the solution to this problem, and it's called the Child Savers movement. And if you hear child savers, you're probably going to say, oh, that's a good movement, but it really wasn't, and it's very similar to what we have today. So throughout this, even though this particular video, I am going to be drawing contrast from how Europeans European immigrants when they came to America, and also I'll be going through Native Americans, you can draw a contrast, and it's important for you to do that because you're going to see how the same excuses that were used to oppress Africans became to oppress even whites and more so Native Americans were very much weaponized and are being weaponized against Africans today. So continually draw parallels throughout this video. Now, the child savers, they were these white middle class Protestant white women mostly who would literally go throughout the streets, urban streets, and look for children who were poor. That was their job. Now, they were looking for things that's important to emphasize. Children, not just poor, but more so like crime prediction, meaning vagrancy, a child that has nowhere to go. If you had a child doing some type of illegal, like, those games that they play when they're betting and stuff like that, anything that could look like this person in the future might engage in crime, that gave them merit to literally take those children and go and take the children and go and take them to these. They could go to orphanages, they could go to almshouses, which were basically homes for the poor, or they could give them to charities. And a judge would basically sit over there and say, okay, we give you jurisdiction over these children. Very reminiscent, like I said, to what we have today with caseworkers. So it's important to understand that they saw themselves as rescuing children from dysfunctional lifestyles. They felt like their home environment was naturally dysfunctional. And so the best thing to do was to take them out of their environment and put them into a better environment. And this is a theme that is consistent whenever you look through white supremacy, something called environment theory, meaning it's not the fact that we're oppressing you that's making you that's putting you in this position. That's not the fact. It's the fact that you're in the wrong environment. So let's take you and put you in a better environment where you'll be able to be like us, where you'll be able to adopt white customs, where you'll be able to assimilate into European society. And this is consistent. Like even back when you read the writings of people, whenever they would go to Africa and they would see these Africans, they would basically say, oh, they're like this because they're in these jungles, they would write these horrible stories that like were so exaggerated and so put out of context, and they would take these things back to Europe and say they're in the wrong environment, their environment is savage, they use words like that. And if we take these people and put them into a better environment, they become civilized. And we can see how this works against our interests, because obviously whenever you look at how do you mask white supremacy, you mask it as if it's something good, as if you're trying to help people. And that's literally what was done by these Europeans whenever they would encounter people they wanted to control. Now, also want to emphasize that the poor parents, whenever their children were taken, some of them like literally didn't know where their child was. Like it wasn't even like today where at least you get like a court notice, hey, we have your kid. You don't know where your child is. And because you don't know where your child is, like you don't even know like what charity to go to and get your child back. And let's say like you literally lost contact with your child and you can't find them. Over time, they'd say, well, you abandoned your child. A lot of parents literally just didn't know where their child was. And that's how they masked it as abandonment. Now, probably one of the most infamous examples of the child savers movement came during something called the orphan train movement. And this was something, again, it's really indicative of this environment theory. Environment theory, we're going to take you children who are in your savage environments. In this case, they're saying the Irish slums or the German slums, these are savage environments. We're going to take you and we're going to ship you out west. And in this environment, you're going to become assimilated. The idea was if you're inside of a family that is a white Protestant family that's going to be of upper class, you're going to adopt who they are. And this was put into place by a man named Charles Loring Brace. I'm going to just read a quote from something that he wrote whenever he was basically pitching these ideas called The Dangerous Classes. He says, the dangerous classes of New York, they're mainly American born, but children of Irish and German immigrants. They are ignorant as London flashmen or costmongers. They are far more brutal than the peasantry from whom they descend, and they are much bonded together in associations such as Dead Rabbit, these are old gangs, Plug Ugly, and various other target companies. They are our enfants perdus, grown up to young manhood. The murder of an unoffending man is nothing to them. They are ready for any offense or crime, however degraded or bloody. You get the picture of how they're looking at these poor immigrant kids. It's like, wow, these people are bloodthirsty. And as they said, you know, they see someone being murdered and it doesn't affect them. And this demonization, again, draw parallels to how we're demonized today in order to justify policies by this racist government. Another quote that I want to read by Charles Loring Brace is that he says, because I want you to understand like the anxiety behind these policies. That's the other thing we have to understand, is that they didn't just come up with the child welfare system just randomly. Like there's anxiety that's creating these systems that oppress us. He said there are the same explosive social elements beneath the surface of New York as of Paris. There are thousands on thousands in New York who have no assignable home and flit from attic to attic, cellar to cellar. There are other thousands more or less connected with criminal enterprises, and still others, tens of thousands poor, who are hard pressed and depending on daily bread, on their day's earnings, who are swarming in tenant houses, who behold the gilded rewards of toil all about them, but are never permitted to touch them. And this one I think is very important. He says, vagrant youth gaining influence and power if they will gain influence and power if they're not tamed. Sorry, this font is like way too small. These boys and girls, it should be remembered, will soon form the great lower class of our society. They will influence elections. They may shape the policy of the city. They will assuredly, if unclaimed, poison society all around them. They will help to form the great multitude of robbers, thieves, and vagrants who are now such a burden on law-respecting community. And there are more quotes that I use, you know, for Charles Loring Brace's from different writings from him. But really what it was, they were afraid that these poor people who were flooding the cities were going to riot and they're going to have some type of revolution. In fact, one of the quotes that I pulled, actually he references a revolution or some type of revolutionary activities that were happening in Paris at the time, to say, hey, y'all, we have to get in charge and in control of these kids. Otherwise, they're going to throw us out of power. Again, this is anxiety that is prompting these actions and these policies. So going back, you know, the orphan train, actually, I'm going to show y'all some pictures real quick because I want y'all to get a visual. Let's see. Okay, so this is literally the pictures from the orphan train movement. You literally see kids literally like they took them and put them on trains and sent them out west. That's literally what they did. These are real pictures. And whenever the kids went out west, let's say they were again Irish, Jewish, German, they weren't allowed to have their racial identity. Essentially, they had to adopt the identity of their what we would now call their foster family. So essentially, I'm going to live with some Anglo-Saxon people. I'm no longer whatever I am. I'm no longer Jewish, German, Irish, whatever. I'm now Anglo-Saxon. A lot of them also had to change their names. And even like some of them didn't even know that they were, some of the young ones didn't even know that they were once of a different origin and had belonged to a different family. So going to that, I want us to do what I talked about in the first video that I did, and that was way back, I think in January or February, probably February. But to just briefly go over it, it's called systems analysis. Systems analysis, we don't look at what the system says it's for. We look at what the system actually is doing. So number one, what are you doing? And is what you're doing accomplishing the purpose? If it's not accomplishing the purpose, that means that the purpose that you're telling me is not the true purpose. So if we're going back to a systems analysis, what we see is that the original setup of child welfare in America, it was prompted again by anxiety, it was prompted by crime prediction, and it was really used for social control, which is why I said, you know, in the book, the child welfare system's design of social control of the Black family. That's what these systems are for. So if we look at the outputs, you know, of the system back then, and we look at it today, I'm going to show you all a chart. I'm going to share my screen again. If I can do it right, here we go. So this is a chart of, I believe it was 2019. This shows you how many what the children who are in foster care today, the reasons why they're in foster care. If you see 61% of the children in foster care is for neglect. It's important to emphasize neglect is literally poverty. In fact, let me scroll up. I think I have right here the definition of neglect: the failure of a parent or other person with responsibility for the child to provide needed food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision to the degree that the child's health, safety, and well-being are threatened with harm. That's poverty. Literally, like you're saying, if you can't provide for your child's needs, therefore you are guilty of neglect. Now, if you look at the numbers, 61% of children, it's not because their parent hit them, it's not because their parent molested them, it's not because their parent left them somewhere. It's because their parent was not able to take care of their child because they weren't able to provide for their child. This is what the system is for. Drug abuse, 34%. Drug abuse is closely correlated with poverty. 34% children, and a lot of people, like, we should understand, are functional drug users, and doesn't mean that they can't necessarily take care of their kids. A lot of times it's a matter of supports, but a lot of times it will be like literally just you could test positive for something and all of a sudden drug use, your child's in foster care. Inability to cope, physical abuse, child behavior problems. We're going in order from the biggest percentage of children in foster care to the least percentage. Housing, 10%. Parent incarceration, 8%. Alcohol abuse. And let me actually go back to parent incarceration. I think that number would be bigger in retrospect, but it's rare that you have both parents in foster care. Both parents incarcerated. So let's say mom is struggling to make ends meet because dad is incarcerated, right? They would put the emphasis on mom because she's the one that's able to take care of the child. Dad, who's incarcerated, he's incarcerated. But if both parents were incarcerated, then they're going to say, oh, parent incarceration. So it's important to emphasize a lot of kids' parents are incarcerated. And I would say that has a direct correlation to the fact that a lot of parents are not able to provide for their children. So again, we have to be careful when we use their definitions. Alcohol abuse, abandonment. Now we have sexual abuse, drug abuse, child disability, relinquishment, parent death, alcohol abuse of the child. So I think, what I'm trying to paint is that the vast majority, the vast majority of the children who are in foster care, it has nothing to do with their parents are unable to take care of them. It has nothing to do with their parents being violent. It has it has more to do with their parents being unable to take care of them. It has nothing to do with their parents being violent or sexual abusers. And this is important to understand with systems analysis, because we can identify that the system of foster care in the United States of America, the reasons for it's not to protect children, it's to regulate people who are considered oppressed, people who want to be subjugated, in our case, relegate people in the African community in America. So I'm gonna just pause before I switch gears. I'm about to go to the next chapter. So I'm gonna see if there's any questions. And if you have questions, feel free to also post it in the chat, and I'll get back to it after I cover the next chapter. I'll put some comments up. Yes, when I found systems analysis, that's actually probably the thing that made me want to write the book to begin with, because I knew something was wrong in the foster care system, but I didn't know how to label it, because like I said, what they put out there as far as the reasons for the system are all good things. They say the system is here because, the system's going to protect children, because we're going to make sure families are stable. So when you're hearing that, it's like, well, that's not adding up to what I'm seeing in practice. But when you look at systems analysis, and I actually first encountered it from reading a law article, you realize, oh, wow, okay, there are other ways to identify the system, not what they're telling us, but what they're showing us. And so I think it's very effective way for us to be able to identify the outputs of white supremacist systems. We got Brother Ikemba. The architects of this system that control institutions of child welfare have historically created orphans through genocide and slavery. Absolutely. And, probably whenever I do the chapter on as it applies to African children, like it's going to be very stark and very apparent. So let's go and switch gears. We're going to talk now about child welfare to Native Americans. Now, let me say, like with Native Americans, if you're going to compare the struggle of Africans in America to anyone, and I don't think it should be compared necessarily, but if you were looking for someone to compare it to, you would have to compare it to Native Americans. No other group inside of this country is here because involuntarily. No other group, basically were stripped from their civilization aside from Native Americans and Africans in America through the transatlantic slave trade. So we also should understand there are a lot of correlations between what happens with Native Americans to what happens with us. So let's go into the intentional effort of the United States to deal with what they'll call the Indian problem. And when I say the Indian problem, and I use Indian because this is what the white racists would use, but I personally say Native American or Indigenous American, but we're going to use their term, the Indian problem. The reason why they would say something like that is because they have a problem. There's land. They want this land. They want the resources in the land. They want to harvest the land. They want control of the land. But there's this huge indigenous population who's on the land. How are we going to justify this? Okay, we're going to find ways to try to get rid of these people. Now, it's important to understand that extermination, genocide, all of these things were on the table to begin with. War, any type of way to basically rid indigenous Americans of their lands. It was on the table to begin with. But they ended up figuring out there are other ways to control this society. There are ways that don't necessarily cost us as much. I'm going to talk about the cost benefit analysis that went into some of these campaigns. And we can instead we can be more we could be more compassionate. We can bring these indigenous Americans into whiteness. And that's literally what they did. It was an intentional effort to erase any culture from them and to make them like white. And to this day, a lot of people in white society do have Native American ancestry. That wasn't by accident. It was an intentional effort to basically bring them into white society and water down their lineage so that they no longer posed a threat to the dominant society. Continue, as I said, to draw parallels to Africans in America. So the first one I'm going to talk about, these are not the only things that were done to assimilate Native Americans. These are the big things that identified that I would say correlate directly to the child welfare system. So the one is the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act was by Senator Henry Dawes from Massachusetts. And he basically said, okay, we have these indigenous Americans and we want their land, but they own land communally, something that we can relate to as African people. Prior to becoming enslaved in America, we owned land communally. Communal ownership of land, this is the reason I'm anti-capitalist, y'all, is a threat to white supremacy because they want private ownership of land. So whenever you have a people in a community saying, hey, we're just going to share the resources, we're going to share the land. I actually did not realize I'm still sharing my screen, my bad. But yeah, so whenever you have a people saying, yes, we want total control of your lands, private ownership is the way that they achieve that. And it's important for us to know that because whenever they come to us and say privatize, 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 we should understand privatization directly correlates to the conquering of indigenous people everywhere. Anytime you have the settler colonialist or the colonialist come into a country, what are they saying? Privatize. Privatize because we want control over that thing. We want to take it out of the hands of the community together, and we want it to solely be inside of our hands. So it's just important. I know some of us who come on my channel and whatnot don't like when I criticize capitalism, don't like when I say I'm socialist, regardless of if you identify as socialist. You know, to me, I'm not attached to any term as much as I'm attached to results. Anti-capitalism is absolutely essential to undoing white supremacy. Privatization is a European concept, and the whole purpose of it was to basically lay claim to your lands. Because if you think about it, if an outsider is going to come into Africa and say, hey, this land belongs to me, they need some type of doctrine to back that up. And they created these laws that said, whoever possesses it first. There's actually a legal doctrine called adverse possession. If I'm on your land long enough, then it becomes my land. Who do you think came up with that? Obviously, that was not us. So these are systems that are important to understand. Now, the idea of the act was that you're going to basically privatize Native American lands. I'm going to sum it up because I don't want to spend too much time on this. They basically divided up Native American lands and said, okay, you own this land communally. No, from now on, you're going to own this land privately. Not only that, but we're going to make this the path to citizenship. You can no longer be hunter-gatherers. You can no longer live communally. You can no longer find ways to engage with each other as far as your society. You have to be privatized and individualized. Again, this is literally what they need for us in order to control us. And the thing about the Dawes Act is that it didn't necessarily work as far as bringing so many Native Americans into society, go figure. But the unfortunate reality is that it did have a negative effect. It destroyed thousands of Native American indigenous languages. It erased a lot of cultural or cultural exchanges. Like, it literally had a devastating effect on Native American culture and society. So that's important to understand. This was a prequel to what we're going to talk about next. And this one is more, I think, towards the child welfare aspect. The Indian boarding school movement. Some of you might have heard recently, like, there are boarding schools in Canada where they were called Indian boarding schools, and they're finding indigenous children who their bodies are dead, in mass graves. This is not just in Canada. This was in America. I believe it actually it came out of America. Canada just took it by extension. This was the chief campaign of assimilation, and it was implemented under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was going to be a system of forced assimilation that was going to go after the children. And we should understand children are sought after. Understand, for us Africans who have children, our children are sought after because they feel like it's easier to assimilate children than to assimilate adults. Obviously, when you're a child, it's harder to remember things. If someone teaches you something from an early age, teaches you that you are white, teaches you that this is your religion, teaches you that this is your culture, if you're taught these things from an early age, then it's harder to shake it than actually adults who are being told the same thing. So there was an intentional effort to go after children. During the height of the boarding school era from 1880 to 1930, almost half of all Native American children were forced to attend off-reservation boarding schools. Now, it's important to understand there was a lot of debate about this. Originally, you could attend a boarding school that was near your reservation, and that was okay to them. But then this guy who comes in, Captain Richard Pratt, Captain Richard Pratt, he comes in with this message: no, we need them away from their reservations. We need them away from their community. We need to make sure that we intentionally put them off, because we don't want them to even go home to see their mom and dad. We don't want them to even communicate with their family. Like, we're going to literally indoctrinate these children by all means necessary. Now, it's important to understand with the Indian boarding school movement, there was also a cost-benefit analysis I spoke about earlier that was done. They figured that it would cost $1 million to kill a Native American in warfare, but only $12,000 to acculturate of them at a boarding school. Yes, they actually sit down, if y'all don't know, and they do cost-benefit analysis. We can kill these Africans, or we can just make them, like us. Which one do we want to do? Let's just do the one that's cheaper. And the sick thing about this whole idea, it's cost $12,000 to acculturate them. The sick thing about that is that because of that, like, whenever these children were taken to these boarding schools, there was an intentional effort. We're going to do this as cheaply as possible because we have to make sure that we're following, this budget that we created for ourselves. And you're going to find out just how the conditions were basically horrible. And that's why you're finding these mass graves of children, because there was an intentional effort. We have to do this as cheaply as possible. Now, like I said, Captain Richard Pratt, he was an Army officer. He actually was in charge of Native American prisons, and this is where they recruited this guy to take charge of the boarding school movement. This is some speech that he had. The name of the speech: "Kill the Indian, save the man." You could probably see where this speech is going. I'm going to read from this. Let me make this font a little bigger so I could read it easier. He said, "It is a great mistake to think that the Indian is born an inevitable savage. He is born a blank, like the rest of us." And let me pause right there and say, this is the same type of propaganda that's utilized today whenever they're saying things like transracial adoption is good for African children, or these things are okay. It's this idea that we are a blank slate and there's nothing different from us. Left in the surroundings of savagery, he grows up to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. We, left in the surroundings of civilization, grow to possess a civilized language, life, and purpose. Transfer the infant white to the savage surroundings, he will grow to possess a savage language, superstition, and habit. Transfer the savage-born infant to the surrounding of civilization, he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit. Now, going back to what we said about the European immigrant children, we said environment theory, the idea you take them out of their environment, you put them in another environment, and that's going to basically create a civilized person. Here you are right here. They're saying the same thing about Native Americans. And again, I know we're going to get into that in the later videos because I'm going to do these videos every week until I get through this book for the year. But I do want to emphasize that you're going to hear the same verbiage used against African children. This idea that they don't have a culture, they're a blank slate, they're basically just like us, so we could put them wherever they want. I'm actually going to pause, see if there's any questions real quick. Let's see. Let's see, one question. How do you think the foster care system is influencing other minority social workers? Do you think they are still promoting the systemic issues? Yes, absolutely. I talk about this and I think I talked about it in the first video, but in chapter 1, I go into detail. This is a rationale that's often used by people who say the child welfare system cannot be racist because we have Black caseworkers. I'm telling you, as someone who worked in the child welfare system, I was not a caseworker. I represented children. And to me, that entering into that position, I thought that it was like the safest place to be. You're just doing what the child wants you to do. You are complying with that system. If you don't comply with that system, the system gets rid of you. That's the thing about systems analysis that's important for us to know, is that anything that's a threat to the system, like if the system senses that this person is going to lead to self-destruction, they'll just get rid of you. Think about all the police departments where you hear about officers who actually do speak up and say, like, I don't know if y'all remember, I think it was with Philando Castile. There was this one African woman officer, and she came out and she blasted the police and said, take the Ku Klux Klan hood off and, go with them or whatever. She got fired. And this is what they do. If you are a threat to the system, they will get rid of you. Now, I'm not saying that there are not ways to basically do your best, given the circumstances. And I'm not necessarily like condemning all caseworkers. By the way, my mother is a caseworker. She's very much in line with me with what I say about the system. But it's important to not be disillusioned. It's not to say you're a caseworker, you're an agent of the system. I think that you can use that position to make sure that you're advocating for the family more, to make sure that you're pushing for more services, that you fight back, from those. But you should also be aware and be ready to deal with the fact that there could be consequences for your career. There could be consequences for your advancement. There could be consequences for your interactions in the office, because when you are a true threat to the system does what it can to isolate you or else dispose of you. And so this is a present reality for all of us. I think just don't be disillusioned. My theory always with like us who live in the systems of white supremacy, and we have to obviously work inside of the systems. Number one, we always work in these systems with the intention that whatever we're doing in here, it's for our people. So we are there specifically to get the tools to dismantle white supremacy from being in the system. That's why we're in the system at that moment. But at the same time, my personal feeling is I could not ever be okay with doing anything that has a negative effect on my community. And things like being a prosecutor, I could never do that. I could never be a cop. There's certain things to me that I think we should draw the line of. I could never be in the CIA. I think we have to draw some lines. So that's my personal philosophy on that. But Rudy, how are you? He says, Tierney, are you saying that the child welfare system was designed to house children from poor families out of fear that those kids are destined for criminality? Yes, criminality, but even further, destined for possible revolt against the white supremacist system, possible revolution, and removing the powers that be. That's what the anxiety is. And that's what we talk about social control. When we go into the later chapters, And I'll probably try to do this every Friday, y'all, to try to keep it consistent so that if anyone wants to follow along, you can follow along. That's literally, when you look at the prison industrial complex, that's what it was for. It was to control. Whenever you have the war on drugs come in, it comes at a time in the African community where they realized that their power was threatened. I mean, this is after the civil rights movement and then the Black Power movement. And then all of a sudden, do we think it's coincidental? Right after the Black Power movement, these drugs, unlike ever before, flood our communities, and then these cops flood our communities. No, in fact, the term war on drugs came out before the crack was even in the community. That should be a red flag right there. So yes, the child welfare system, systems of white supremacy in general. And I also meant to emphasize before that when I was talking about how they'll try to do things cheaply as possible, as you've seen with the Native American boarding schools, I would say that's the same thing that we see today. So we have like these foster care, the services are horrible. Children who are being traumatized, children who are being removed from their families, children who are being exposed to sexual abuse in the system are given the most subpar services. They're trying to do this as cheaply as possible. So understand these cost benefit analysis are also happening with us. Okay, I think that's, I see another question. Fostering false identity, the child welfare system's design of social control of the Black family. I want to make sure I'm getting the right one. Yes, I put the link in the chat early on, but this is the book, Fostering False Identity, the child welfare system's design of social control of the Black family. Sometimes I forget the full title. All right, y'all. One more question I see, then I'll go back. So what are the alternatives? So many children, even our community, particularly in inner city communities, are in fact exposed to abuse. Absolutely. I'm going to definitely go into that more inside of the following videos, because I go more into like the fact that our communities are in disarray. So this is not to paint a picture that abuse is not happening. What I will advocate is that we find, kind of like how you see Ethiopia right now saying African solutions to African problems, we need to find African solutions to these problems, understanding that the white supremacist system is literally incapable of addressing the issues that we do have. We have trauma, everyone. We do have trauma. We were enslaved. We were put into prisons. We were subjugated to horrible racial violence. We are traumatized people, and traumatized people, unfortunately, oftentimes go forward and traumatize each other. So this is something that we understand. We understand we have to deal with our own issues. I've been hearing about a lot of people, Africans, getting killed this week, and it's disheartening. But we understand that the system of white supremacy is never the answer. The system is always going to be us being able to gather as a community. And I will also argue inside of the, whenever I do the later videos on the later chapters, I argue directly that you can really draw a correlation between the destruction of the Black community by white supremacist forces and the increase inside of things like abuse. The abuse is a symptom of society. They're the ones that created it. They're the ones that have put us inside of this position where we are desperate and unable to do things right, and unfortunately sometimes go and traumatize other people. So they're the ones that create this machine, and so we have to be the ones who undo it. Okay, so I'm going to, I see one more question. All right, this is the last question before I go back. Hello, sis. Would you say that the American establishment is designed to keep Black Americans trapped in America as hostage Americans? That's an interesting question. I don't know. That's hard to say, because there have been different times in history, like where they were trying to like get us out of America. What I will say is that I think that particularly us in America who are politically aware, that we pose a threat whenever we go back to Africa, and that if anything, the people who they want to go back to Africa are those that adopted this society's principles and want to take those principles to Africa. The principles, like I said, of privatization and this mass capitalist, principles. Those are the people who I think are most encouraged to go back. And whenever you see Africans who are political going back, that's always a risk to the system. That's why whenever Malcolm X went to do a tour of Africa, the CIA were following him every single step that he took. So, that's what I would say. All right, so I will go back to these questions whenever I finish. How do I hide? There we go. When I finish this particular chapter, because it gets worse, y'all, unfortunately. So education, let's see, where did I leave off? Okay, so it should be emphasized that whenever children were put inside of these Indian boarding schools, that they had to lose their culture, similar to what you've seen with the European immigrants. You had to cut your hair. You know, the Native Americans culturally will wear their hair long. They had to cut their hair. They had to put on European clothes. They could not speak their native languages. They could not practice their tribal religious practices. They couldn't do any of that. I want to show y'all, I think I have some pictures. I did not get some pictures, but I can find it very easily. Indian boarding school. And you all can look this up too. I just literally Googled real quick, Indian boarding school before and after. I'm gonna share my screen. There we go. So as you see, these are literally pictures from actual Indian boarding schools. They have before and after. So I'm gonna talk like a white racist, savage versus civilized. That's what this meant. If you see right here, oh, these children to the left, they're uncivilized, but we civilize them. You know, that's the mentality. And these pictures, you know, they're kind of creepy whenever you look at them, but this is what they used basically to say that, hey, our program was a success, you know. This person came in one way and they exited another way. So this is just, I think, very important for us to understand, particularly, you know, I see this movement, and I used to never really, you know, think too deep into it, but there's kind of like this idea that Africans, you know, if we're wearing suits and have our hair cut and look presentable by European standards, that's moving forward. I think that a lot of that goes right directly to the assimilationist logic that a lot of us have been exposed to just by being inside of this system. We should never think that looking more European exempts us from the struggles of being African in America, or makes us a better position to address the problems inside of our community. So that's just a thought that I have about some people that think wearing suits is the best thing ever. I want to also go back into the conditions, like we said, a cost benefit analysis of these schools. Now, because of that, there were, like I said, very poor conditions, overcrowded housing, inadequate food. The infrastructures at these schools was horrible. The medical care was horrible. Malnourishment, overcrowding, I think I said that. Reliance on the children. The children were used as labor. You know, they're like, we're not just going to have these children here. We're going to make them work and actually get some money out of this. And obviously the teaching wasn't anything, you know, low, even for European education. These teaching standards were very low. And that's why thousands, and we don't know how many, we're still finding burial grounds, or we're still finding mass graves. Thousands of these children were killed just by going to these schools. Also, I want to emphasize, a lot of them were actually abused at these schools, physically, sexually abused. So that's another added trauma. The effects of the Indian boarding school, horrible effects, very traumatized people who would oftentimes, again, so their purpose was, we make you European. Well, the two things a lot of times would happen. Sometimes you would have a child who has been so ingrained with these principles, so ingrained with this assimilation program, that they go back to their communities, they go back to their tribes, and they don't relate anymore. And they actually kind of become an outcast because they've adopted so many of the Europeans' cultural things. And we can think of probably people who might go away and come back to our community, and then they're just like, whoa, well, you're so different. It's the same thing. The other thing, though, is that a lot of them would go back to their tribes and they would look down on their tribes. They would say, yo, y'all are uncivilized. Oh, I'm better than you. I'm going to go live with the whites. We see that happen also inside of the Black community in America. So this is the boarding school. I think you get the picture. This is literally traumatic for children, traumatic for Native Americans. And you hear, like, if you ever want to just look into it more, look on YouTube. Like, there's very sad stories of people who were just like mentally destroyed, you know, who were boarding school survivors. It's a very horrible thing. Now, but we have to talk about child welfare, because that's the whole point of this video. So we're going to relate this directly to what happened with Native Americans in the child welfare system. Now, the Indian Adoption Project, yes, that was a project, and it was by the federal government. It was funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Children's Bureau from 1958 to 1967. The project was created in an effort to ease the process for white couples who are seeking to adopt Native American children. And the same thing's going to happen when I go through, you know, basically the projects that became created to get Black children adopted. But yes, there was a shortage of white babies for white couples. And so they had to feel, it's like supply and demand, as crazy as it is. They felt like they were fulfilling a demand by getting these children some white or some Native American babies. Now, the Indian adoption project, to them, it was like, again, a solution to this Indian problem. You know, we want to make sure that these tribes, you know, first of all, there was always intentional efforts by this government to undermine the sovereignty of the Indian tribes, not only giving them the worst lands, but also trying their best to renege on even the treaties that they created. And so this created a real problem. Harry Truman's Hoover Commission in 1949, they actually wrote this. It's actually like a written by this commission. They said the basis for a historic Indian culture has been swept away. Traditional tribal organization was smashed a generation ago. Assimilation must be the dominant goal of public policy. They write these things out, y'all. Now, to give you an idea what happened with the Indian adoption project. So you actually had the actual project, but then you had like subsidiaries that operated under the project. The actual project, only 395 Native Americans were adopted by these white couples. But the breadth of the project, these other organizations that were operating under the same project actually had 12,486 Native American children adopted through the project. And this is important to emphasize because you all know that Native Americans do not encompass a big part of the US population, and they're only more so populated in certain states. So this is a significant number of children being taken out of families. In addition to these high numbers of Native American children that were removed from their families, you also had a significant amount that were put into foster care. Now, there was an act that was passed. We'll go into that act just briefly, but at the time of the Indian Child Welfare Act, 75 to 80% of Native American families on reservations had at least one child in foster care. I'm going to say that again because I know sometimes I just speak quickly. 75 to 80% of Native American families on reservations had at least one child in foster care. That's huge, right? Child removals from Native American parents were rarely a sign of actual danger, the same thing that we see with these immigrant children that came from Europe. In fact, 99% were taken on the basis of vague standards such as deprivation, neglect. Again, neglect is still a standard that's used today. And they were basically thought to be too poverty stricken to support their children. So the same things are happening right here. We see the same elements, the same excuses for ripping children from their parents. This idea that the parents can't take care of them. Therefore, we're going to control this problem by putting these children with these white couples. Now, very briefly, because you know it's a lot when it comes to the Indian Child Welfare Act, but I do want y'all to know that that's kind of what not eliminated this problem, but it definitely lessened it. The Indian Child Welfare Act actually came into place from the 1960s and 1970s. We know the Black Power movement was going on at that time, and many of you might know that the Black Power movement inspired something called the Red Power movement. And the Red Power movement, credit to them, they were able to get something passed out of this that went directly to the child welfare system. So the Red Power movement basically pushed the agenda that we need to get these Native American children with Native American families. And so this law exists called ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. Essentially, anytime that a Native American child is taken by the state, and this is how it's supposed to run, anytime they're taken by the state has to contact the tribe, and the children's tribe. So anytime, if any of you are ever in child welfare court, you'll probably see the judge ask the parent, are you Native American? Are you of a Native American tribe? If the parent says yes, that triggers an automatic requirement that they go and find the tribe, find out, does this parent belong to you, to your tribe? And therefore, if so, then they're supposed to turn over jurisdiction to the Native American tribes. Let me also emphasize, a lot of times they don't turn over jurisdiction, particularly in those states when Native Americans are more heavily populated, where they're more of a threat to the culture to the dominance of the white people. You'll see the judges find ways to not turn over their children to the Native American tribes. And it's also important to emphasize in closing that although this law does exist, Native Americans are still very much disproportionately in the child welfare system. In 2007, Native American children were twice more likely to be in foster care than the overall population in several states where they're basically the majority population. So I am finished finished with my presentation. I'm going to look back and see if there are any questions. And the best way I can know if you wrote a question for me is if you put a question mark. So let's look back. Let's see. I don't see any questions. Please do. Oh, how did they get light skin? I actually don't know. I assume it might be makeup. That's probably what it was. And I know back then, like I think men and women also wore makeup. But yes, they, and some of them, like, you know, it's like, wow, like, is this the same person? But this is how they were able to assimilate these children into this culture. Okay, so I'll give it a couple more minutes, or one more minute, to see if anyone has a question before I close out. And I am going to post one more time for this video, and or if anyone wants to read this book themselves. It's Fostering False Identity, the Child Welfare System's Design of Social Control of the Black Family. So seeing no questions, I'm going to basically wrap up. So like I said, I'm going to try to do this Friday mornings at this time and allow everyone to ask questions. If you have the book and you had questions that you felt like weren't answered, you know, great to post them inside of the chat. The purpose, again, of this is because we have to understand that this is really a threat in present reality. I see a lot of Africans who are more comfortable organizing around things like the prison and industrial complex than the child welfare system. And I think part of that is obviously the disinformation campaign, the idea that children that are in child welfare, their parents are all bad parents and that they deserve it, you know. And I'm not saying you all believe this, but I think that there's definitely a segment of our community that does believe this. So I think because of that, people are less comfortable organizing around this system, because ultimately we understand that children are our most precious asset. Anyone that would hurt a child, obviously, has a certain place inside of, you know, how we view them. But because of that, that gives the system license to literally take children from their parents. And that's a very traumatic thing. Every time I hear a child taken from their parent, it distresses me personally, because I understand that that child is going to go through, just from the traumatic event of being separated from their parent, but also being put inside of this system. The system is very barbaric, very vicious. I hope we all understand. If you don't understand, there are many more horror stories of children that went into foster care than children who were abused. And I said this in the first video. I do want to emphasize it again, that even whenever you have children who are similarly situated, so let's say the parent has just as much money, or the parent has the same type of behaviors or accusations, the child that goes into foster care always ends out worse as far as long-term effects than the child that was kept with their family. So that's just something for us to keep in mind. I see one question. Do you see any immediate resolution? Do you think going back to Africa years later will change the system? The resolution in America, in my opinion, is we have to just understand the realization of organization. I think some of us have the surface level understandings of organization, but when we understand it as like we're forced to organize, I think that's different, because, you know, what I'll talk about later is that at one time we were our own child welfare system. At one time, whenever all of these white people were put into the child welfare system, we had to find ways to deal with the circumstances and still take care of our children. So understanding that that's the only solution. We have to build institutions. And I know it sounds like a cliche by now, because everyone says build black, build black. It's literally the truth. It doesn't even have to be necessarily a money-making business. Like, it could be an arrangement where we say, okay, everyone in our community, we have to find ways to take care of each other. So let's have a group of parents, and if you need me to watch your child, I got your child. If you need something for your child, I got your child. Let's just have this group as this community group where we're going to find ways to solve our problems together. That is an institution. Institutions are when you have people come together with one accord for mutual purpose. That's what we need. So that's what we need in America. I'm sure many of you know, like me personally, I'm more Africa focused, because I do personally have a hard time believing that America is going to change. And even with our own institutions, I still think that the system is always going to strategize, how do we find ways to infiltrate, as they have in the past, or how do we find ways to basically thwart any efforts at independence and sovereignty. And so I do feel more connected to the African struggle, in that it's a struggle for land and sovereignty. When I say African continental struggle, it's a struggle for land and sovereignty. I don't see the same I don't see the same level of success for land and sovereignty in America as I see in our homeland. And I also just feel more connected to Africa. So I also think that if you want to go to Africa, we also talk about it with We Charge Colonialism. You go to Africa, go for a revolutionary purpose, go to continue to struggle there, and don't go necessarily to run from the problems that America has created for us. What do you think about the fact Native Americans can be Caucasian or free to self-identify as such? I don't know of too many instances of people who were fully, I don't know if it's fully, but people who, have a real identifiable Native American ancestry being white. So that might be an issue I'm just not privy to, but I am privy to the fact that a significant amount of white people do have Native American in us. I always hear Black people say, I'm Native American, and some of us don't even have it. I would say most of us don't have it, even though we think we do, or we have a very, very small percent. But like I said, there was an assimilation campaign. So for those Native Americans who were not going to be destroyed from extermination and war, a lot of them became basically a part of white society. And generations later, you probably can't even tell, like, a lot of people actually have Native American ancestry. So all right, everyone, thank you for tuning in. And tomorrow, WCC is having our podcast and book club. Please tune in for that, 10 a.m. on Saturday, 10 a.m. Eastern time. And then also on Tuesday, I'm going to be interviewing Brother Obi Egbuna Jr. He always brings the fire. So the time, I believe, is Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So thank you all. We'll see you.